Good afternoon. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the kind of keynote number 3 of this conference. As a kind of final statement, we want to have another conversation here together with you. If you watched, or if you have also been at yesterday's panel in the evening, where we were more talking about, let's say, the overall potentials of the German and European industry with regards to the blockchain. We had now the idea to get a little bit deeper into technology. Of course, we're not going to discuss technical details here because that's not the right format, yeah. But look to what does it really mean to develop blockchain-based solutions, products, applications, whatever. Before we start, let me shortly introduce our panelists, if you don't know them already. Let's first start with, well, lady first, Vinita Ratti. She comes from an investment bank background. She has a passion for fintech. She used to be a VP at Goldman Sachs and is now CEO and founder of Systango software consultancy. And of course, she's really heavy into blockchain. Secondly, let me introduce Michael Kollein. He has studied law. He's the only not techie here in the round. Yeah, he studies law and is a researcher at the German Research Institute of Public Administration. And yeah, he works constantly together with computer scientists. And I think his mission is to bridge the world between law and tech. Let me next introduce Peter Lorre. In the Java world, he's known as the guy with most of the Java answers on Stack Overflow. He's the CEO and founder of the company called Chronicle Software, and they are specialized on low latency trading systems in London. And he's also experienced developer and architect of blockchain solutions. And last but not least, Ingo, as I already said yesterday, he's co-founder of the German software consultancy ThinkTexture, main advisor of this conference here, and he's interested in more the B2B side of blockchain technologies and use cases. So that's it from my side, and as I already said, feel free invited to add also your questions or comments to this conversation. We are also curious to learn a little bit what you learned during this conference and what your impression is. Yeah. And let's just start. First of all, when we were preparing this panel, we said, okay, let's categorize a little bit the conversation into 2 main fields. The one field is looking to the blockchain solution. What is different to traditional software engineering? That's one thing. And secondly, we also would like, of course, talk a little bit about the second field. So what are use cases which make sense for the blockchain, and maybe what also the limitations of blockchain, because the stuff is new, and as always with new technologies, the fantasies are very wild. Yeah, oh wow, now we can do everything with the blockchain, and maybe this is not always a good idea. So it's also important not to only speak about the potentials, but also the limitations of new technology. So let's just start. As I just said, a blockchain is not just another technology, not just another version of .NET or Java or whatever. So it seems to be a fundamental different thing. Really spoken from a, let's say, developer's perspective. Ingo, what would you think? Being a software developer, I want to get into that. Is there something in principle which where I have to change my mind compared to, let's say, traditional software tools, traditional product development in the software world?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there are multiple areas. In general, blockchains are, of course, just another new technology, just another technology at the end of the day. And especially in B2B environments, when we look at private blockchains, they are essentially new ideas of how to replicate databases. And even if we look at public blockchains, they are large ideas of how we can globally get a globally trusted replica of a certain piece of information. So on one hand, it's just a way of storing data and interacting with data. On the other hand, if you use a blockchain just to store data, just as another database, you are not really using the key idea of blockchain. I think the key idea of blockchains is decentralization. For me, in real estate, there is the saying that in real estate, when you purchase real estate, there's only one thing you have to look for: location, location, location. In blockchain, it's decentralization, decentralization, decentralization. And decentralization includes governance processes, and I think that's the main difference for software developers. You have to build a technical implementation of your governance idea for your blockchain network. If you don't do this, you're not reaping the benefits. You're not generating value for your network at the end of the day, because you control, you centralize it.
As we started with tech, Peter, you're also the second techie in the round, yeah? What do you think?
I'd agree with that. In many ways, it is similar to some of the distributed ledger technologies that have occurred before, but in particular is the ability to ensure that the records are not manipulated, and in the case of public blockchains, not created fraudulently. So that provides right or corruption protection. There's still some questions around how do you provide privacy protection, because how do you automatically validate a message you can't otherwise read is a bit of a challenge. But nevertheless, that is one of the key features, because you're decentralizing control, you're decentralizing even management, so that you're not necessarily relying on any one organization or individual to run this service, and that's fundamentally different to what you do in a database. Another key thing is that if you are doing a public blockchain, one of the key benefits is protection of the messages that are sent to the server. In protecting it, you sign it, the message, which then means that it can't be manipulated. So in a standard web service, there is a protocol between your web interface or your rich client and some sort of web service. That message gets transformed, often barely recognizable, and may go to many different destinations, be broken up. That's not really possible, because you can enrich a message, you can add things to it, but you can't alter the original message. So then what gets exposed to the end client is the message that will be processed by the back end. So that's one fundamental difference, that you are exposed to the same key that you create is the one that has to be accepted by the back end, that you can use it for verification.
And Vinita, if we look to the larger picture, Ingo also already mentioned the term governance. What do you think in terms of methodologies or the framework? Not only speaking about technology, do processes, methodologies, or let's say the habits inside an organization have to change in order to support the development of blockchain-based solutions products?
I wouldn't say that it has to change per se, but and this is true for any technology solution that you are evaluating at any point of time. You just have to take a step back, review it from a neutral perspective, identify what are the pros and what are the cons, and then just work towards, like, what your business objectives are. And this is like standard for any technology solution that you evaluate. It could be blockchain, it could be just replacing your relational traditional database that you're using at the moment. It has to make sense, it has to be cost effective, it has to make sure that it meets your business objectives. I was reading a study that just came out this morning. In 2017, about 76% of the use cases of blockchain use was within financial sector. In 2018, that number has come down to, I think, about 46 or 47%. What that tells is that there are different use cases that people have started exploring of using blockchain in other sectors other than like traditional financial sector.
From a law perspective, is there something an organization needs to learn when it comes to blockchain-based activities?
How I see blockchain is, first of all, from a human rights perspective. In the 70s, when we had no computers around, the German Constitutional Court said there is a human right of self-determination about your information. So you should have control over your data, and you should be able to trace the footprints that you have. Back then they were thinking in paper files, of course. So this was the ideal, but then the data protection law that was constituted was thinking, okay, there is always a controller who controls all the data. And the whole law is built on this idea, that there's always someone who is liable and who has the control over the data. Interestingly, now from my perspective, blockchain breaks this development a bit different and brings actually the development back to the value that the Constitution says you should be able to trace your data and don't trust in a data silo. Like for me, the situation now is that my data is somewhere, I have no idea where it is, who is doing what with it, and who's selling it to who, and I have no control. So I'm very far away from what the German Constitutional Court had in mind in the 70s. But at the same time, my data protection law doesn't fit anymore because I can now decentralize the responsibility. So the interesting part for me is how can we change the data protection law, which is based on centralized data processing, into a new way that is also covering the decentralized way, which is actually closer to the value of the human rights. And that's the interesting part for me, mostly about blockchain.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we just I'd like to ask everybody here in the round, is there something, or what was your most, let's say, surprising or most exciting experience you personally made when working with blockchain stuff? For you?
So for me, the most exciting one was, and that's really literally the one, is I think the most exciting thing is when you write the first Ethereum smart contract, you publish it onto public Ethereum, and you send your first transaction to it, and you see that for whatever reason, it works. Mm-hmm. You know, that's something which, this wasn't possible before. The whole idea that we can send a transaction and decentralized processing over 25,000 nodes, like this, without any preparation, was incredibly humiliating one side of it, and humbling, because well, okay, so there's something behind this. Okay,
cool. Vinita?
So recently we started working on a project that involves talking to multiple blockchains, so we had to write this wrapper service that basically talks to different blockchains and submits transactions, but then at the same time does not gives handle to the private keys of the users on behalf of whom we are submitting these transactions. It's an irony that we had to actually go back to two-factor authentication, like standard mobile app, via which we were authenticating users, and then we were looking at their private keys, using that for a very, very small time period, and then submitting the transaction on the specific blockchain. So for me, it was like, again, going back to the previous way of how you would architect a solution, but then just making best use of blockchain and what's out there already in the traditional architecture.
Okay.
Yeah, for me it was when I started reading about blockchain, it was in newspapers and magazines, things that I can understand, because I cannot read code. The first thing that lawyers always thought is, okay, it's an immutable chain, so we cannot delete anything. So nothing can be deleted, and if we delete something, the whole system gets unfunctional. And what I was really surprised when I started talking with my colleague Christian Wirth, we will talk also later, I have a talk, that actually there is solutions how to delete data without making it not functional. So for me, it was like the typical lawyer view of seeing this, and I thought, this is impossible, and this is what many lawyers did, and then going deeper into it, I thought, actually we can solve it and go around this problem, and this was something for me very eye-opening to see. If you go into the details, there's new answers to problems that seem unsolvable.
From my perspective, I've always worked on infrastructure parts of software. So from an infrastructure point of view, you're just manipulating and passing around data. And infrastructure is very neutral to the business case. But blockchain is the first time I've seen where infrastructure actually has a responsibility to manage the financial aspects. And in fact, the commercial viability of the solution comes down to infrastructure components. So it's quite interesting to bring that commercial aspect to a lower level into the platform itself. So implicitly, every individual transaction can have a cost or associated with it, for example, which was in a web service, you have nothing like that. You can do that as sort of like an afterthought, but the reality is there's no easy way to monetize a web service except through, say, advertising. Whereas with a service like blockchain, you can put microtransactions, and because it's built in, it's quite efficient, so you can have very small transactions and still be commercially viable.
Any questions from you or any remarks? So please just raise your hand if you want to add something. We try to see you. And there's also a colleague of us, Tanya, with a microphone helping. Yeah, so feel invited to jump into the conversation as well. Thank you. Okay. I remember exactly in this building we've been doing a machine learning conference last year for the very first time. We also had a similar discussion because everybody said, oh wow, machine learning, I can solve now all the problems I had previously, or said differently, there's a new solution and now I'm looking for enough problems, yeah, for that solution. Getting into now back to blockchain. Have you seen any, let's say, scenarios where you said, or where you would say from today's perspective, no, it's not useful to really use blockchain because maybe it's a trivial case or something like that? So kind of an anti-pattern from your side. Did you have any examples maybe?
Oh, number of times, and I used this example like yesterday. There are a number of times when people will come to you and will say, we want to use blockchain in our architecture because our investors are asking for it. Right? Mm-hmm. And then you have to actually explain them that if there are pros to using blockchain in an architecture, there are a lot of cons to using it as well. This specific conversation that we were having was about messaging app. So it's a corporate messaging app. That gives licenses to individual corporates for doing messaging each other as an employees amongst each other. I can't see any use case of using blockchain in that architecture. Even if your investors are asking for it, I think storing those messages in blockchain is not going to help anyone. First of all, it's a single corporate, so there's no consortium, as in you don't really want to bring in transparency or immutability or whatnot. If it's a single corporate, even a traditional relational database can just do what you're after, rather than trying to put in blockchain as a storage solution in there. So, and there are different classical questions like those where people just want to use blockchain because they want to use blockchain. And that's my first advice to anyone and everyone, that don't try to use a technology because it's a buzzword in that given period. Try to use it because it makes sense.
You also got an anti-pattern?
So one of the key things that you tend to have is for any systems, you want some sort of reporting. You want to be able to query it, sometimes ad hoc queries, sometimes canned queries. You want to report on how the system is doing. And this inevitably means that you'll probably have some sort of database for that reporting function, because one of the things blockchain's not good at is querying. You can run through the entire data set to extract information out, but that may not be practical, whereas an index database is probably a more natural choice. So given you're probably going to need a database, you then have to say, well, I can't get rid of the database. I still have to have it. I still have a lot of records in there. What does the blockchain add that now that I have to have a database, I'm not also having? And so from my perspective, it's where there's some benefit in having lots of participants run the nodes in the cluster where they don't have to trust each other. They trust the protocol, but they don't have to trust each other. And there's a business benefit in doing that. And in particular, I see that as being from my background in consortiums. But certainly, unless someone, I would say that unless someone actually explains why they're using blockchain, and it's not just probably for some sort of fundraising purpose, then that may be legitimate in itself, in the sense that they need to raise money. They've used blockchain to help them do that. But further down the line, to actually run that service, I would look at, well, is there an actual technical benefit?
Okay, so first I would totally agree with the two of you, so I'm not going to go too deep into this one. But if you can implement your business case with a centralized solution, a database on top, on an API on top, that's quite likely what you should do. However, there are also other blocking issues, and I think one which is very important, which we've seen quite often, apart from the idea that we want to use blockchain because we have to and now tell us how to do this, is blockchains are replicated databases. And this means that we have the same issues we've had with all replicated databases in regard to the CAP theorem. The fact that you have either consistency, availability, or partition tolerance in a system like this. And depending on the blockchain technology you choose, you get two of those. Because the CAP theorem states that out of these three, you can only get two at any point in time with the given system. And so if you want consistent data which is highly available, it's not partition tolerant and all other combinations. And the same is true for blockchains. And for nearly all the combinations, which you could realize with taking 2 out of 3, there is a blockchain-based technology which implements it in this way, and it doesn't give you the third option. And we tend to sometimes, or projects sometimes tend to forget this. So if you have a blockchain which is highly consistent and which is partition tolerant, then it won't have high availability. It's just not possible. And I think that's important to remember this. It's still a replicated database at the end of the day.
Please.
My perspective is different. What I was surprised about, or what I can just tell, is that a smart contract is not a contract in the legal sense. I mean, this is something I stumble a lot on, people with ideas to reproduce legal transactions.
Make legal text executable.
Yeah. It's just the execution of the contract. It's a software in the end. So smart contract is a software product, and it tells how to execute something, but it's not the virtual contract and the meeting of the minds which a contract constitutes. And there's a lot of things, because the legal, it's a complex system, the legal system, and it's based a lot on interpretation. And it's based on distribution of power between different actors. So the idea to just bring two legal specifications just into code and then you solve the whole problem is something that I met a lot. But this is something to be taken very serious. Maybe the biggest fail of this is, I mean, we all know it is the DAO, where they thought, okay, I can just make a system and it solves all the problems that will ever come in the future, and we don't need anyone to look on it. This is not going to work, because social interdependency between people is much more complex than just reducing it to mathematical formulas.
Actually, to let me add to this, if it's okay, from the technical point of view, the crew who coined the term smart contract for Ethereum when they started this whole idea just had a discussion on Twitter about a month ago where Vitalik Buterin said, you know, the one thing I regret most, or something along the lines, is to call it smart contracts. We should have called it persistent scripts. And another researcher of Ethereum said, well, we should have just called it stored procedures. And because that's what it is. In our mind, you know, a smart contract has nothing to do with the contract. It's not smart, it is a stored procedure at the end of the day, which is executed in a distributed and trusted way.
So we already started a little bit because I wanted to also learn a little bit if there is kind of a, let's say, checklist from your side, or if you can recommend some checkpoints where it definitely makes sense, so the more the positive way to get into blockchain solutions. We already said, okay, if it's about decentralization, are there some more points which you recommend, okay, you should look to this and that and that and that in order to make sure that getting into the blockchain direction might be the right choice?
Yeah, so I would say go in with the assumption that you're going to need a database. and then say, well, does blockchain give you anything more than just the database will give you? And decentralization is one example. A trusted relationship, it may be fundraising, so there may not be a good technical reason, but if it makes the difference between the project getting funded or not, then okay, you know, I'm not against that. It's just that you just have to be realistic with yourself that that's not a technical reason. I think that's, but it's, the question is, is it, the main thing to compare it with is a database, and can you do something with it you couldn't just do with a database?
And the data integrity, so like the immutability of the data. Right?
Yes.
So, and I think it's important to distinguish that if the question is, can the data be changed, or has the data been changed? Like, you know, so if you want to make sure that in your system data cannot be changed, then probably blockchain is the answer. If you just want to prove or state that you'll have an audit history of has the data been changed, then even a relational database, like, you know, can do its work. I think another important aspect, and it's probably because of smart contract, people are exploring blockchain in insurance sector, in e-governance sector, because of the power that stored procedure or smart contract has. I think it gives you a long-term behavior of any asset class over a period of time in a trustless environment, and that people can actually view it, that people can review and leave, like, you know, comments for. So it also adds transparency to the whole system as well.
Well, my perspective is more on the public sector, and there also we have the problem between different state actors that they don't trust each other. It's a classical problem. Let's say, I mean, now it's pretty obvious that many nations don't trust the European Union, or different states of one country, like in Germany we have 16 states, they don't trust each other, and there's the constant find about whose data is it, who controls it, and which database is it stored. And in these scenarios, for me, it can be a really nice way to say, okay, nobody owns it, we share it, and we have like really strict rules who can access it under which conditions, and that we can actually trace it. I mean, for me, still, this is something that I would like to have, that I really know what happens to the data that I give to a government, that I see, okay, this agency has looked at it because they wanted to check if I really have a driver's license. I don't know, the police has checked it because they thought I'm a terrorist or whatever, you know. So this transparency in the use of data is like the second advantage, where I would also, I mean, the problem is in the public sector is that most decision makers in the ministries don't have it on mind that there is blockchain and that it could be useful for them. So for my sector, it's more important to raise the awareness at the moment. And that's what we're trying with different talks and presentations and papers. But that's still a long way, because these are people who are not techie and don't really care about it, and are often happy with old solutions.
For me, there is one detailed aspect which comes up in discussions, and whenever this is met, then the use case is usually quite nicely mappable onto blockchain. And this is, if you look at your group of participants for which you are designing the system, and you look at the power, the negotiation power, the financial power behind the strongest participant and the weakest participant. If this difference is really huge, then you might not need a blockchain. So one of the prime examples is when Walmart goes to their public relation team and they make a traceability blockchain for some of their food produce, so you can trace it back to the source. That you don't need blockchain for this. Walmart forces its suppliers to send this data to them anyway. They are the largest retailer. They put suppliers out of business if they don't conform. And so they don't need a blockchain. They use it just for marketing. So that's one thing. If you have a group of peers who are largely equivalent, let's say if you have 16 federal states in Germany, they are equivalent. And so this is where it makes a lot of sense, because you don't have a natural centralization of power anyway. And these fit onto blockchain.
Let's say, let's come back more to a more practical side, and it showed sometimes up. Who's usually, or do you see some patterns, who's usually, let's say, the driver for blockchain solutions? Because on the one hand, you just said it is hard for non-techies to understand the impact blockchain can have on the one hand. So is it like with many, let's say, younger or newer technologies that the techies are the drivers, yeah, and see the potentials of stuff, yeah? Or is it more a top-down thing? What do you observe, or is this very heterogeneous?
I think from all the conversations that I have had, in every company there's always this technical evangelist, right? And they are the proponents of anything new that has come out in the market, and they are the one who pushes, like, you know, any specific technology forward. As much as I would love to give all the power to this technology evangelist, I think it's also dependent on, like, you know, who the CEO is, who the CTO is, and then the solution itself. So I think it has to be a strategic decision coming from the top, but with relying on their evangelist to decide what's best for the company.
Mm-hmm.
So it tends to come from, in my view, two directions. One is who has the financial power to put resources behind it. In an ICO case, it's people on the internet who are putting money, investing in it. Therefore, they're basically on board with the idea that blockchain should be used, technically merited or not. But they're driving it. Or it comes from higher up in management who have approved it and said, look, sometimes they don't know for sure they need blockchain yet for specific purposes, but they know that in the future they're probably going to need it for something. So they need to increase the level of knowledge and expertise within the company so that when it is identified they need it, they're ready to capitalize that. They're not left behind as a result. So to some degree it's an insurance policy rather than a direct, I have a need right today. Another direction I see it coming from is more from within developers themselves. So developers are doing something similar. They're future-proofing their career, or they're enthusiastic with new ideas. And they start using blockchain because they have a certain amount of discretion in how it's implemented. And they've gone and used blockchain maybe without approval, but because they have the ability to just make it happen. So I think it's mostly from those directions, either someone who has the time or the money, essentially.
Any questions from the audience? That's your opportunity.
I might add this, like, for me it's interesting to observe that blockchain has come from a very libertarian point of view, or it seems like where it came from, like almost an anarchist stance, and that then it has been captured in a way by the financial industry that it was somehow pointed against. So it comes from a thing that anti-state, anti-banks, but then it's the financial industry who's capturing it. And this is something I think that happens to a lot of technologies, that it's really at the end, as you said, who puts the most resources in it, and it's always who's first, and who can kind of, in a way, dictate their perspective on this technology. So this is interesting just to observe on the one hand side, and about the other thing that maybe concerns people who have to make decisions is that there are some aspects that they don't understand. For example, for me, what I still don't understand is, can I really trust cryptography? I mean, as a non-mathematician, I just don't know. I mean, I just know the 70s, there's some encryption which is easily broken into now, but I don't know. I mean, if we all base it on cryptography, which is somehow safe now, I don't know if in 30 years, all my records which are on-chain will be transparent. And that's something which would be totally against the intuition of actually putting it on blockchain at first. So there's still these kind of leftovers, if you look deep into it, where you at the end still have to trust. And maybe one more aspect that I found interesting is it was all about getting rid of intermediaries and the third parties. And I mean, looking at cryptocurrencies, right now I cannot buy a Bitcoin with my laptop because it's just too slow. I mean, the one I have. I don't have a big server in my home, so I still need the marketplaces to sell me cryptocurrencies. And then what's different from banks? I mean, I mean, the banks are maybe even more regulated than the marketplaces. So it's interesting to see like how new problems keep popping up despite all the enthusiasm at first.
I also think that we have to be realistic about how this changed over time. You know, if you talked with somebody about blockchain 5 or 6 years ago, they were quite likely a miner interested, a developer interested in the mining process, having minted a few bitcoins on their own hardware, etc. If you talked with somebody about blockchain, let's say at September last year, they were interested in blockchain for a totally different reason. They are interested because they've seen the price development of Bitcoin.
But it was just traditional speculation, wasn't it? Yeah.
But
it had nothing to do with the internals.
Exactly. Yeah. But managers and CXOs and investors, they have seen the rise in the Bitcoin price. They've seen the massive amount of ICOs and the valuation early stage companies are getting. So this spurred a lot of interest because people say, so what's happening here? Something is happening, and now we see the same as you have illustrated. We see it from both sides. We see technologists still being interested in it from a technical point of view, and we see the executive side being interested in it for the, well, obviously there is something happening in the world. We don't know what it is, but we need to find out what it is, and we need to find out if we have to change our model, if we have to use this, or will it obliterate us at the end? And these are the questions the executives are posing mostly.
Yeah, so a couple of things that I would add to that is that one thing that I observed about banks is they don't like to be the first to do anything. They're not innovative in that sense, but they don't like to be the last either. Mm-hmm. So if they see that other participants are working on something, they're much more inclined to pick up on it, and so they can be much more interested then. Another thing to note is that even though Bitcoin is designed to be decentralized, in reality, it goes to the producers who are the most efficient. So the people that can produce the coins the most efficiently can invest in the hardware, get access to cheaper power, and therefore can reinvest. And like in any competitive market, you see a consolidation of the most efficient participants. And so what's happened in Bitcoin and even in Ethereum is that a fairly small number of participants have more than 51% of all the power. So it's not actually as decentralized as it probably was originally envisaged.
Okay. Some more remarks? Yes. First of all, here.
You've talked a lot about adoption without ever mentioning APIs or interconnectivity with existing systems. I want to say something very provocative now, but Blue Ocean strategy doesn't work outside of startup culture. You have to work together with your existing systems. You can't build something entirely new and ignore the existing systems. So for me, when talking about adoption, I ask myself, how does it work together with the technology we have now? Because saying, oh, it's something new, it solves a new problem, that doesn't help me if I can't get, for example, my data from SAP in and then my data to my letters I have to write to my clients because for legal reasons out. So I think maybe you can elaborate a bit more on how you see that happening in the future and how that works together with adoption of blockchain.
So I just jump right in because that's an area I work most in blockchains and business solutions. And none of the clients we work with, none of the development teams we work with are a typical ICO environment. So they are always creating software using existing parts, existing backends. And the question is always about how to integrate this. And you know, depending on the blockchain technology, there is always a way that you integrate your existing data with a blockchain. You use the blockchain not to replace your core business model. Most of these companies we work with don't do this, but they use it to augment some kind of business process which involves other parties as well. And of course there are gateways in between. So there are on what you would call on Ethereum, you'd call them oracles. So bidirectional links to outside data, which you can put into the system in a certified or non-certified way. And maybe we should do a session on this at the next iteration, because I think oracles are extremely important concepts. Because that's a question, it's a standard question. If you're not in an ICO world, your blockchain project doesn't live on a green field. There is no green field in enterprise today.
Yeah, certainly agreed. No matter how greenfield you think your project is, in reality, you are working with existing technologies. You will be using a language that exists, an IDE, a tool set that exists. You will want to integrate it with something. You want to be able to receive data from somewhere. You want to be able to send data to somewhere. So even though you might start off with a vision of it being completely greenfield, it's actually integration that will determine whether the project's successful or not. I guess integration doesn't get as much interest, largely because it's more of an established practice, and it's possibly a little less exciting aspect of computing, but it's certainly very important, and it can determine the success of the project.
And I think just to add to that, most of the use cases of blockchain that I think most of us have come across is an enterprise environment. In an enterprise environment, generally, blockchain usually is used at the storage layer. It never replaces like your front-end layer. It will never replace your client apps for that matter. So you have to keep all of the other layers where you are doing a lot of your data processing or logical processing, and then your client apps intact, and all you do is just replace your storage layer from maybe relational database to blockchain, given you are encountering certain problems in your current architecture. And what that essentially means is it's very similar to when you do a legacy architecture migration to a newer architecture, where you have to write down how the current system works, how do you want to migrate to the new system, what is the must-to-have list. It's a standard process, and it has nothing to do with blockchain per se.
Okay. Puya?
Quick question, maybe extremely trivial, but often when I see examples for blockchain, I always get reminded of event sourcing. Is that stupid?
Well, technically, if you look at most blockchains today, they are an implementation of an event sourcing system with some kind of distributed consensus layer on top, so that we can agree what's the right sequence and which events are really in the sequence. So yes, if you look at Ethereum, that's an event sourcing system with a bit of consensus on top.
And it's usually some cryptographic element, either hashing or signing, for the immutability in particular. But nevertheless, yeah, it is fundamentally external to the blockchain itself. It is fundamentally an event source with some extra guarantees that you don't necessarily get in an event source.
Okay. One more question? Yes, please.
I am from ICL Box, and we spoke a lot about, you guys spoke a lot about our Bitcoin, Ethereum, and both of the blockchains were really popular these years, and both are mineable. So there are certain issues with that some group of miners could control the whole network, 31% attack, and so on. And today there is a different approach that is on the rise. I'm talking about, first of all, Ripple is a non-mineable and much more centralized blockchain. And my question is, what do you think about it? That's the next trend, as I said, and certainly the adoption of Ripple will be, from my perception, much faster than it was for Bitcoin and Ethereum, because there is certain entity that is interested to adopt it and to promote it. Do you think it's good, bad? Okay, thank you.
So first, I totally agree that the Ripple case is very interesting. If you look at the market capitalization of Ripple and how fast it grew compared to how fast or slow the other systems grew, it's a very interesting case. Is it good or bad? You know, I think what we are seeing is we see a move from the mining-based chains to chains which are not proof of work mining-based. No matter if they are Ripple, or no matter if you have hardly centralized system, or you have this delegated proof of stake systems like EOS. And you know, so we see some experiments. For me, EOS is an experiment right now. It's a blockchain which was able to capitalize, I don't know, up to 4 billion just in their ICO, which was unheard of before, which was a very intransparent ICO, however, so we don't know how much of the money was actually circulating at that time. But there are a number of 2021 block producers who produce all the blocks for this chain. Is this good or bad? I think that we see a second phase of experimenting right now. The first phase of experimenting was to try proof of work in a large scale. That's where we are. We've learned a lot of proof of work which we didn't know at the beginning of Bitcoin. And now we are entering the next phase to try more centralized, more officially centralized protocols, because even Bitcoin is centralized using the mining via the mining pools. Is it good or bad? Well, this would be an interesting question. If I would know this, I would take all my money and put it into exactly this currency which I believe in. The fact that I don't own a significant amount of any cryptocurrency should make it obvious, or I'm not hiding the fact that I don't know the future.
So the reason why Ripple came into existence was because of a problem that generally Chinese manufacturer and Western economies face. So like if you need to transfer money to a Chinese manufacturer, it generally takes anywhere between 5 to 10 days traditionally, following through all the paperwork, transferring the currency, the recipient getting it, and then they processing your order and then sending the consignment. Ripple has claimed, or the technology has claimed, that transaction time can be reduced to anywhere between 1 to 3 days, which is going to be a huge improvement over current processing time. There are about, I think, 96 or 97 banks who have signed up for Ripple protocol. However, the reality is that none of them have actually gone in production. That is, like, you know, they're actually doing transaction real time as of to date. Everyone is in POC stage at the moment. Everyone has like done one transaction and has said, oh yeah, it took 1.5 days or it took 2.5 days. But none of them is actually happening right now. And only time will tell if the technology actually delivers the claim that they initially did that they would.
Another thing to consider is Ripple as a company predates a lot of the boom. And in many cases where you've seen solutions take off, they actually predate the Bitcoin hype in some manner. They'd already got going or had a use case, often in some sort of distributed ledger. So Hashgraph, for example, that whether Bitcoin had taken off or not, that company probably would still be around. But then what they did was they saw, well, they can see we've got a solution that's 90% there, and blockchain's taking off. Let us align the product more with that solution, and we can benefit from some of the media attention. So again, Ripple, the way they were heading, they probably would have the solution today regardless of whether Bitcoin even existed. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it proves they had at least a planned business case that was independent of whether Bitcoin was the right, blockchain was the right thing to use or not. So this is one thing that I would say that Ripple's a little bit different, is that they probably would have existed even if they'd not implemented it as a blockchain.
Cool. So thank you very much. This conversation is now coming to an end, because in 8 minutes the next sessions are starting, and maybe there's an opportunity to have just a conversation between you peers directly. I'd like to thank you panelists for being here. Please give them a hand. I wish you all a good afternoon with the rest of the conference program. I'd like also to say thank you for joining us on behalf of the entire team of SNS Media who produced this conference. Of course, I'd like to thank all the speakers who contributed to this wonderful conference program. Some of them are still here, some of them already left, however. And there was a frequent question about how can I access the slides. So all of you attendees are going to receive an email later with a detailed instruction, and I think in around 1 week you get an access to the slides. not blockchain-based, but traditional on the server. Last but not least, don't forget to give us your feedback through the app. There's an overall survey asking you how you'd like the conference venue, the program, did you miss something, things like that. And as a thank you, you will receive a conference t-shirt as a souvenir, which is also, maybe the weather is too cold for t-shirts, but it's a nice souvenir. And last but not least, thank you, and hope to see you next year.